Five Nights at Freddy's has grossed over $1 billion. It spawned 10 main games, dozens of books, a hit movie, and a fan base of millions around the world. The premise seems absurd at first glance. You're a night guard at an abandoned pizzeria, trying to survive murderous animatronics that come to life after midnight. Robotic bears, rabbits, chickens, and foxes that want to kill you. Sounds like the most ridiculous idea for a horror game, right? But here's what most people don't know. Scott Cawthon, the creator of FNAF, didn't invent this idea out of thin air. He didn't wake up one day and think, what if pizzeria mascots were scary? The truth is far more disturbing. The core elements of Five Nights at Freddy's, pizzerias with animatronics, missing children, violence in supposedly safe places for families, didn't come from pure imagination. They came from real events, from documented incidents, from things that actually happen in establishments exactly like Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And when you discover which events inspired the scariest game of the last decade, you'll never look at FNAF the same way again, because the reality behind the fiction is more disturbing than any jump scare the game can give you. This isn't a video about FNAF lore or fan theories. This is about the real side of Five Nights at Freddy's that will give you actual nightmares. However, the golden age of family entertainment centers. To understand where FNAF really came from, we need to go back to the 70s and 80s, an era when America was obsessed with a specific type of establishment: pizzerias with animatronic entertainment, Showbiz Pizza Place, Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater, Discovery Zone, and literally hundreds of smaller imitators scattered across shopping centers and suburban neighborhoods from coast to coast. These places were the epicenter of children's culture of that era. If you were a kid in the 80s or 90s, your birthday parties probably happened at these establishments. It was where your parents would drop you off for hours while they shopped. It was the reward for good grades, the weekend destination, the magical place where mediocre pizza and arcade games combined with shows of robotic characters singing pop songs. The technology behind these shows was genuinely impressive for the time. Showbiz Pizza's Rock-a-Fire Explosion, created by an inventor named Aaron Fechter, featured animatronic bears, gorillas, and other animals that moved with surprising fluidity. They played real instruments, sang harmonies, moved eyes, mouths, ears. For children who grew up before CGI and modern special effects, these robots were absolutely magical. They were like cartoon characters coming to real life. Chuck E. Cheese's had its own line of animatronics, centered around a mouse named Chuck E. Cheese who played keyboard and sang rock and roll. The shows were synced to cassette tapes, programmed to move in specific patterns. Children were mesmerized. Parents found it charming. The entire industry was growing exponentially with new locations opening every week. But why were these places so popular? Why were parents across the country so willing to leave their children at these establishments? The answer has to do with the cultural moment. It was before home internet, before smartphones, before video game consoles were common in every household. Out-of-home entertainment was crucial, and these pizzerias offered something unique. A space where children could have relative freedom while parents knew they were safe within a controlled and familiar environment. The key word here is relative, because behind the shiny surface of neon lights and children's laughter, there was a much darker side to these establishments that most families never saw. From the dark side, nobody saw. Anyone who worked at one of these places will tell you the same thing. The backstage areas were completely different from the customer experience. While the dining area was loud, colorful, and full of artificial joy, the back parts of these establishments were dark, claustrophobic, and often neglected. The animatronics themselves, when seen up close and out of context, were disturbing. Without proper stage lighting, without music playing, without the chaos of screaming children to distract, these robots were unsettling. Their mechanical movements seemed wrong. Their glassoctized fluorite tester, their jaws opened and closed with sounds of creaking mechanisms, Employees frequently reported having to enter maintenance areas after closing to adjust or shut down animatronics that had malfunctioned. Imagine being alone in a dark building, hearing servo motors humming, seeing these 10-foot-tall figures twitching randomly in the dark. Maintenance was chronically neglected. These robots were expensive to repair properly, so many franchise owners made improvised repairs. Exposed wires, torn foam coverings revealing metal endoskeletons, plush costumes stained and reeking of mildew. Some animatronics remained partially functional for months, stuck in strange positions or making disturbing repetitive movements because nobody wanted to pay for the repair. The overall hygiene of these establishments was also questionable. Carpets rarely cleaned properly, sticky with soda residue and pizza sauce from years past. Playground tubes that were never sanitized, becoming breeding grounds for bacteria. Inadequately supervised bathrooms, dark areas where children could get lost or hide. The layout of these places was often labyrinthine, with confusing hallways and multiple exits. And then there was the question of employees. These were minimum wage positions with high turnover. Background checks were minimal or non-existent in many places. Training was rushed. Supervision was inconsistent. You had poorly paid teenagers and young adults, often resentful, responsible for the safety of hundreds of children. Most did the best they could, but the system wasn't set up for maximum protection. The environment was perfect for accidents. Children got hurt frequently. Fingers caught in arcade machines, falls from playground structures, fights that got out of control. But accidents weren't the only thing that happened at these places. Something much, much worse was waiting to happen, and eventually it did. Furbusier and the Aurora Massacre, Colorado, 1993. Chuck E. Cheese's in Aurora, Colorado was a typical establishment. Located in a suburban shopping center, it served families from the Denver metropolitan area. On December 14, 1993, it was an ordinary Tuesday night. Children played arcade games. Families ate pizza. The animatronics did their programmed show. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But a former employee was watching. Nathan Dunlap was 19 years old. He had been fired from Chuck E. Cheese's 5 months earlier, in July, supposedly for being late and having poor performance. Friends and family later said he never got over the firing. He talked about it constantly, felt he had been treated unfairly, and on the night of December 14th, he decided he was going back. Dunlap arrived at Chuck E. Cheese's around 9 p.m., shortly before the 10 o'clock closing time. He blended in with the last customers, played a few arcade games, acted normally. Nobody on staff recognized him, or if they did, thought nothing of it. When the establishment closed at 10 and employees began their cleaning routine, Dunlap hid in the bathroom. He waited until only closing staff remained. Then, around 10:15 p.m., he emerged from the bathroom with a .25 caliber semi-automatic weapon. What happened in the next hours devastated the Aurora community and sent shockwaves through the family entertainment industry. 5 employees were shot. 4 died. Sylvia Crowell, 19, Ben Grant, 17, Colleen O'Connor, 17, and Bobby Stevens, 20. A 5th victim, Marge Kohlberg, 50, survived by playing dead after being shot. She later provided crucial testimony that led to Dunlap's arrest. The Chuck E. Cheese's Pizzeria, a place explicitly designed for children's joy, transformed into a crime scene. The same establishment where countless children had celebrated birthdays and created happy memories became the site of one of the most shocking mass shootings of the 90s. The juxtaposition was impossible to process. Smiling animatronics and colorful decorations stained with evidence of brutal violence. Nathan Dunlap was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. The case generated national debate about safety in public places, workplace violence, and the death penalty. But for the people of Aurora, and especially for the families who frequented that specific Chuck E. Cheese's, the trauma was deeply personal. How do you explain to a 6-year-old child that the place where she just celebrated her birthday 2 weeks ago is now a memorial? How do you reconcile the joy associated with these establishments with the knowledge that something so horrible can happen there? Chuck E. Cheese's corporate responded with new security measures at all locations, but the damage to the collective psyche was done. For the first time, parents across the country began to question whether these places were really as safe as they seemed. And other documented incidents. Aurora wasn't an isolated incident. While it's the most well-known and tragic event associated with family entertainment establishments, there was a disturbing pattern of incidents at these locations dating back decades. During the 80s, multiple kidnappings were attempted or executed at locations like Chuck E. Cheese's and other entertainment centers. The most notorious case involves the attempted kidnapping of a child from a Chuck E. Cheese's in Florida in 1984. The child was taken by a stranger during the chaos of a busy birthday party. Fortunately, employees noticed and intervened before the kidnapper could leave the parking lot. But the incident highlighted how easy it was for someone to grab an unaccompanied child amid the chaos. The Adam Walsh case in 1981, though not directly involving a Chuck E. Cheese's, fundamentally changed how Americans thought about child safety in public spaces. 6-year-old Adam was kidnapped from a department store in Florida and murdered. The case led to massive changes in child safety protocols across the country, including at entertainment centers. Adam's father, John Walsh, became an advocate for missing children and eventually hosted the show America's Most Wanted. The Adam case and others like it created what sociologists call the stranger danger panic of the 80s and 90s. Family entertainment establishments became paradoxically both symbols of childhood innocence and potential danger zones. Parents began to wonder, if something can happen in a well-lit store with witnesses, it can certainly happen at a chaotic and noisy Chuck E. Cheese's, where supervision is minimal and children wander freely. Violence among adults wasn't uncommon either. Fights in Chuck E. Cheese's parking lots became so prevalent they practically became a dark joke online years later. But at the time, these incidents were genuinely alarming. Birthday parties that got out of control, arguments over tables or tokens, alcohol being consumed by adults who then got into conflicts. In 1988, a fight at a Chuck E. Cheese's in Texas resulted in gunfire in the parking lot. In 2008, a massive brawl involving more than 20 people broke out at a Chuck E. Cheese's in Wisconsin. And then there were accidents with the animatronics themselves. Though rare, there were documented cases of children being injured by malfunctioning equipment, fingers caught in moving parts, plush costumes catching fire due to electrical failure, stage structures collapsing. These incidents were generally hushed up through settlements, but local employees and parents knew. The statistic is disturbing when you compile it. Over 4 decades of operation, Chuck E. Cheese's locations and similar establishments saw hundreds of serious incidents. The vast majority were accidents or minor fights, but enough were genuine traumatic events that they created a pattern. These places, explicitly designed for safety and children's fun, had a documented history of danger.
Why did these places attract so much negativity? Part of it was statistical. Any establishment that sees millions of visitors over decades will experience incidents. But there was something more, something about the nature of these spaces that made them vulnerable.
To the psychology of liminal space, there's a concept in psychology called the uncanny valley. It's the phenomenon where something appears almost human, but not quite, creating a deep sense of discomfort. Humanoid robots, nearly realistic CGI, preserved corpses. All these things fall into the uncanny valley. And pizzeria animatronics fall right into the center of that valley. These robots were designed to be friendly, welcoming, funny, but their movements were just slightly wrong. Their facial expressions frozen in permanent smiles. their glass eyes that didn't blink, didn't react, just stared. During the day, with bright lights and loud music and hundreds of screaming children, these disturbing elements were masked. But take away those distractions, and what remains is genuinely unsettling. Employees who worked closing shifts frequently reported feeling uncomfortable around the powered-down animatronics. There was something about being alone with these figures after everyone had left. Some employees refused to enter the stage areas alone after dark. Reports of animatronics turning on by themselves due to electrical problems were common enough to be almost cliché. A servo motor randomly activating at midnight, making a robotic arm move, a head turn, a jaw open. But there was a deeper layer of psychological discomfort in these spaces. Pizzerias with animatronics were what architects and psychologists call liminal spaces, places of transition that exist between categories. They weren't completely public or private. They weren't proper restaurants or amusement parks. They weren't for adults or exclusively for children. This ambiguity created a sense of disorientation. And then there was the fact that these were places designed for joy that often hid literal darkness. The playground tunnels, the maintenance areas, the dark corners between arcade machines, places where children could hide from parents, where adults could hide from supervision. The architecture of these establishments, though designed for fun, inadvertently created countless blind spots. When places designed for safety and happiness reveal themselves to be unsafe, it creates a specific type of trauma. It violates fundamental expectations. For children especially, discovering that a place associated with birthday parties and joy can also be a stage for violence or danger creates deep cognitive dissonance. It corrupts memory. It transforms nostalgia into something darker. This is why abandoned pizzerias with animatronics became so iconic in modern horror. It's not just about the robots themselves. It's about what they represent. Corrupted innocence, joy transformed into terror, familiar places made strange. It's about the discovery that nothing was as safe as it seemed. And this psychological realization, this understanding that places of childhood joy could hide horror, is what made fertile ground for Five Nights at Freddy's. But Scott Cawthon didn't simply exploit existing fears. He had his own story of how he arrived at this idea. Scott Cawthon and his influences. Scott Cawthon didn't start out as a horror game developer. In fact, for years he tried to do the opposite. During the 2000s, Cawthon created a series of Christian games for children under the title The Pilgrim's Progress. He also developed educational games and family-friendly animations. His goal was to make positive and uplifting content that parents would feel safe giving to their children. In 2012, Cawthon released a game called Chipper and Sons Lumber Cowser. It was a lumberyard management simulation featuring cute anthropomorphic animals. He hoped it would be charming and accessible. Instead, it received devastating reviews. Critics said the characters looked creepy, that their movements were like animatronics, that the whole game had a disturbing quality despite its innocent intentions. For most developers, this would have simply been a failed project, but Cawthon had an epiphany. If his innocent creations were inadvertently scaring people, and if he couldn't make his vision of family-friendly games work, why not fully embrace the scary aspect? Why not make something intentionally terrifying using exactly the elements people found disturbing? Cawthon began to research. He dove deep into the history of pizzerias with animatronic entertainment. He studied Showbiz Pizza, Chuck E. Cheese's, the Rockafire explosion technology. He read about the various incidents that had occurred at these establishments over the years. He examined why exactly animatronics were so disturbing to so many people, and he began to connect the dots. There were the real events, Aurora and others. There were the cultural fears of the 80s and 90s about missing children. There was the uncanny aesthetic of the animatronics themselves. There was the concept of familiar places made strange. There was the vulnerability of being a solitary night guard in a large, dark building. All these elements existed separately in the American cultural consciousness. Cawthon synthesized them into a single game concept. He wasn't just making another horror game. He was tapping into something deep and specific, the collective fear of an entire generation that grew up attending these establishments. People who had memories of birthday parties at Chuck E. Cheese's, who had seen those animatronics move and sing, who had experienced the chaos and claustrophobia of these places, and also people who were aware, on a subconscious level, that something was slightly off about these spaces. Cawthon spent months developing the first 5 Nights at Freddy's game alone. He modeled the animatronics to be simultaneously familiar and deeply wrong. He designed Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to evoke real pizzerias while making every detail slightly more sinister. He created gameplay mechanics that forced vulnerability and helplessness. You can't fight the animatronics, only try to survive until dawn. When FNAF was released in August 2014, it was an instant viral success. YouTubers recorded reactions. Players became obsessed, and everyone began asking the same question: where did this idea come from? How did Cawthon create something that felt so specifically, universally terrifying? The answer lay in the reality he had mined. The real elements in FNAF. When you examine 5 Nights at Freddy's with knowledge of its real-world inspiration, the parallels become impossible to ignore. Almost every core element of the game has roots in real phenomena. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza itself is obviously modeled after Chuck E. Cheese's and Showbiz Pizza. The layout, the 80s aesthetic, the arcade machines, the birthday party tables, the central stage where animatronics perform, all of this is pulled directly from real establishments. Cawthon even captured the specific lighting and color palette of these places: bright neons, saturated primaries, that slightly faded quality of decoration that hasn't been updated in decades. The animatronics themselves, Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Bunny, Chica the Chicken, Foxy the Pirate Fox, are direct analogs of the Rock-afire explosion and Chuck E. Cheese characters. A lead bear playing a musical instrument, a guitar-wielding rabbit, bird characters, a pirate character. All these archetypes existed in real animatronic shows. Their appearances are slightly more menacing than the originals, but the fundamental similarities are unmistakable. The Bite of 87, a background event in FNAF lore, where supposedly an animatronic bit off someone's frontal lobe, echoes real fears about animatronic accidents. While no incident exactly like this was documented, there was real anxiety about these machines malfunctioning and injuring children. The idea of being bitten by a robotic jaw wasn't purely fantastical, it was an extension of parents' genuine fears. The darkest element of FNAF lore, missing children supposedly murdered and hidden inside animatronic suits, directly reflects the missing children panic epidemic of the 80s and 90s. Missing children's faces on milk cartons, Amber Alerts, stranger danger. The paranoia that public establishments were hunting grounds for predators. FNAF took these specific fears and literalized them. What if children really did disappear from these places? What if they were never found because they were hidden in plain sight? The night guard position wasn't invented by Cawthon. Establishments like Chuck E. Cheese's really did employ night security guards, especially larger locations in urban areas. These were low-paying positions with high turnover. Guards worked alone, responsible for monitoring large buildings after everyone had left. It was a lonely and often disturbing job. Real employees reported experiences similar to what FNAF portrays: being alone in a vast, dark space, hearing unexplained sounds, seeing animatronics move due to electrical malfunctions. The animatronic malfunctions in the game are based on real technical problems these machines experienced: servos randomly activating, sound systems turning on unexpectedly, erratic movements due to wear and tear. A former Showbiz Pizza employee once described arriving to open and finding one of the animatronics turned in the wrong direction, the result of a nighttime malfunction. These occurrences were rare but documented. Even the aesthetic of decay in FNAF, worn animatronics, torn plush suits, malfunctioning lighting, reflects the reality of many of these establishments in their final years. When Chuck E. Cheese's and other chains began closing unprofitable locations in the 2000s, many buildings were abandoned with animatronics still inside. Photos of these abandoned pizzerias circulated online, showing dusty, decaying robots in dark dining rooms. The aesthetic was identical to what Cawthon captured in FNAF. Scott Cawthon's genius was recognizing that he didn't need to invent horror from scratch. Reality had already done the work. He simply needed to amplify, synthesize, and present back to an audience that had lived through this reality, but perhaps never fully processed how strange and unsettling it really was. FNAF works because it doesn't feel like pure fantasy. It feels familiar, it feels plausible. It feels like something that could have happened, or almost happened, or maybe really did happen in some untold version of history. This quality of almost truth is what makes the game so effectively terrifying. But the real horror isn't in the jump scares or gameplay mechanics. It's in the realization that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is just a slightly distorted mirror of places where millions of children actually spent their childhoods. Places that were supposed to be safe, but sometimes weren't. Places that were supposed to be magical, but sometimes were just sad and a little strange. Places you remember with nostalgia, but also with an underlying discomfort you could never fully name. And now that you know the real events, Aurora, the kidnappings, the accidents, the malfunctions, the disturbing spaces, you'll never play FNAF the same way, because it's no longer just a game. It's a documentary, a reenactment, a processing of cultural trauma through interactive media. Scott Cawthon took our deepest collective fears about childhood, safety, and familiar places and turned them into a billion-dollar franchise. But there's something even more disturbing about the FNAF phenomenon that goes beyond its real-world inspirations. Something about who consumes this content and why, and what it reveals about how an entire generation processes trauma and fear. We've seen how Five Nights at Freddy's wasn't created in a vacuum. Scott Cawthon didn't invent the idea of murderous animatronics in pizzerias. He distilled it from real events, cultural fears, and collective trauma. The Aurora Massacre, kidnappings at family entertainment establishments, the stranger danger epidemic of the 80s and 90s, the disturbing reality of malfunctioning animatronics, and liminal spaces. He took all these elements and synthesized them into a game that instantly resonated with millions of people. But this raises a much deeper question. Why? Why did FNAF become a massive cultural phenomenon? Why are people, especially young people who weren't even born when Chuck E. Cheese's was in its heyday, so obsessed with this specific concept of horror? And what does FNAF's success reveal about us, about how we process fear, trauma, and corrupted memories? The truth is more unsettling than any aspect of the game itself, because FNAF isn't really about animatronics. It's about something far more fundamental to the human experience. It's about the loss of innocence, about discovering that places of joy can hide darkness, about the vulnerability of childhood, and about how an entire generation is still trying to process what it means to grow up in a world that promised safety but didn't always deliver it. Let's explore the psychological side of FNAF, the side that explains why this game haunts you in ways that go beyond mere jump scares. Corrupted nostalgia and childhood trauma. There's a concept in psychology called corrupted nostalgia, when memories that should be positive are tinged with later knowledge of danger or darkness. FNAF is built entirely around this concept. It takes a nearly universal cultural experience, birthday parties at pizzerias, and transforms it into a nightmare. If you grew up in the 80s, 90s, or early 2000s, there's a good chance you have memories of places like Chuck E. Cheese's. You remember the smell of pizza and old carpet, the sensory chaos of flashing arcade lights and screaming children, the thrill of winning tickets, the animatronic show that was simultaneously fascinating and a little strange. For millions of people, these are fundamental childhood memories, moments associated with joy, excitement, celebration. But now try accessing those memories through the lens of FNAF. Suddenly those animatronics don't seem so innocent. The dark corners of the establishment seem more sinister. The idea of being there alone after dark becomes genuinely terrifying. FNAF took your nostalgia and weaponized it against you. It transformed comfort into discomfort, familiarity into strangeness. This kind of memory corruption is psychologically powerful because it creates cognitive dissonance. Your brain has memories of joy associated with these places, but now also has associations of fear. The two can't coexist comfortably, so you're stuck in a state of unresolved emotional tension. This is precisely why nostalgia horror is so effective. It exploits the fact that we can't easily separate our childhood memories from our adult knowledge. But there's an even deeper layer here. For many people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, there was already an underlying anxiety associated with these places, even before FNAF existed. Children of that era were raised during the stranger danger panic. Pictures of missing children were everywhere. Milk cartons, junk mail, supermarket bulletin boards. Television shows like America's Most Wanted were regularly watched. Schools conducted Don't Talk to Strangers drills. Parents lived with constant low-level anxiety about their children's safety. This anxiety infiltrated places like Chuck E. Cheese's in subtle but tangible ways. Do you remember your mom or dad saying, "Stay where I can see you"? Being instructed never to go to the bathroom alone? Employees occasionally making announcements about lost children? These weren't just casual precautions. They were reflections of genuine parental fear in an era where child abduction had become a national moral panic. Sociological studies from that time show that American parents in the 80s and 90s were significantly more anxious about child safety than previous generations, despite childhood crime rates not increasing proportionally. Media coverage of cases like Adam Walsh created the perception that children were in constant danger. Family entertainment establishments, despite being designed as safe spaces, ironically became sites of elevated parental anxiety. So when FNAF emerged decades later, it wasn't simply creating fear out of nothing. It was activating anxieties that already existed, that had been planted during childhood. It was giving shape and narrative to amorphous feelings of discomfort that many people carried but had never fully articulated. Why did those places always feel slightly wrong? Why did you always feel vaguely anxious there, even while having fun? FNAF offered an explanation, even if fictional, because there was something genuinely dangerous lurking beneath the surface. The psychological genius of FNAF is that it functions as catharsis. It allows an entire generation to confront childhood fears in a controlled environment. By playing the game, you're essentially saying, yes, those places were scary, and my fear was valid. You're processing the cognitive dissonance of having happy memories mixed with underlying anxiety. You're working through unresolved childhood trauma, not trauma from something that necessarily happened, but trauma from the constant possibility that something could happen. This explains why FNAF resonates so deeply, even with people who never experienced real violence or danger at pizzerias. The fear isn't about what happened. It's about what could have happened. It's about the vulnerability of being a child in large, chaotic public spaces. It's about trusting adults and systems to keep you safe. And it's about the gradual realization, as you age, that safety was always slightly less guaranteed than you thought as a child.
FNAF transformed implicit cultural trauma into explicit horror, and in the process, it gave voice to something an entire generation was feeling but couldn't name.
To the mechanics of passive terror, there's a reason why Five Nights at Freddy's is scarier than most horror games, and it has to do with powerlessness. In most horror games, you have some agency. You can fight. You can run. You can actively hide. You can make choices that directly affect your survival. In FNAF, you're essentially immobile, sitting in an office chair, looking at cameras, closing doors, waiting. You can't confront the threats. You can only try to survive until they go away. This forced passivity is psychologically devastating because it replicates how real anxiety works. When you're anxious about something, you often can't do anything about it except wait and see if the worst happens. You can't fight your own anxiety. You can't run from it. You can only sit with it, observe it, and try to manage your limited resources, your mental energy, your capacity to focus, your ability to maintain composure. The animatronics in FNAF move according to their own logic. They don't react directly to your actions in predictable ways. They're coming anyway. All you can do is monitor them and take minimal defensive measures, close a door, check a light. But you can never really stop them. Eventually, they'll arrive. Eventually, your defenses will fail. Survival is about delaying the inevitable, not about victory. This mirrors perfectly how childhood anxiety works. Children are fundamentally powerless. They don't control their environments, can't fight threatening adults, can't escape dangerous situations independently. All they can do is trust that the adults around them will protect them and hope nothing bad happens. When you're a child at a place like Chuck E. Cheese's, you're completely at the mercy of systems beyond your control. If danger materializes, you have no real options. FNAF captures that feeling of childhood vulnerability perfectly. You're not a powerful warrior. You're a low-wage employee in an office chair with limited resources and limited options. The monsters are bigger than you, stronger than you, and you can't stop them. You just hope to survive until dawn. It's an almost perfect simulation of what it feels like to be a vulnerable child in a world controlled by forces beyond your understanding. Third, jump scares in FNAF work differently than in most horror because they're not the culmination of tension. They're the release of accumulated anxiety. The real terror isn't the jump scare itself, but the minutes leading up to it, the sound of footsteps approaching, seeing an animatronic move closer on the cameras, knowing it's coming and being unable to do anything except wait. The jump scare is almost a relief because it finally resolves the tension. But then the game restarts, and the anxiety begins again. This perfectly replicates the anxiety cycle. You build and build tension, waiting for something terrible to happen. When it happens, or when the moment passes, there's a momentary release. But then, the cycle starts again. People with anxiety disorders will recognize this pattern immediately. FNAF isn't just a scary game. It's a simulation of what living with chronic anxiety feels like. And there's another layer, the observation factor. In FNAF, you're not being hunted blindly. You can see your hunters on the cameras. You know where they are. But this knowledge doesn't empower you. It only increases your anxiety. You watch, helpless, as they approach. Constant vigilance is necessary for survival, but it's also exhausting and terrifying. This mirrors the experience of growing up under anxious parental surveillance in the 80s and 90s. Parents constantly watching, checking, monitoring, not because they could actually prevent all danger, but because the illusion of vigilance provided some comfort. But for the children being watched, this constant surveillance created its own form of anxiety. The implicit message was, the world is dangerous. You need to be watched all the time. Danger is always nearby. FNAF captures this paradox. Watching doesn't save you. Knowing the threat is coming doesn't empower you. It just makes you wait in terror. The only thing that can truly save you is dawn, the arbitrary end of the danger period. You didn't win. You just survived. And tomorrow night, you'll have to do it all over again? FNAF's success as a horror game comes from recognizing a fundamental psychological truth. Powerlessness is scarier than confrontation. Not being able to fight back is more terrifying than battle. And waiting and mounting anxiety is more disturbing than sudden surprise. FNAF turned anxiety into game mechanics, and in the process created something that resonates deeply with anyone who has ever felt vulnerable, powerless, or at the mercy of forces beyond their control. In other words, anyone who has ever been a child. FNAF and Generations. Here's something deeply strange about Five Nights at Freddy's. Its most dedicated fan base consists largely of children who never experienced the golden age of pizzerias with animatronics. Children born in 2005, 2010, even 2015 are obsessed with FNAF. They have no memories of 80s Chuck E. Cheeses, never saw the Rockafire explosion perform live, didn't live through the stranger danger panic the same way millennials and Gen X did. So why are these children, without personal nostalgic context, so fascinated by FNAF? The answer reveals something disturbing about modern children's culture and content exposure. Much of Gen Z's exposure to FNAF comes through YouTube, not necessarily playing the games themselves, but watching countless hours of gameplay, fan animations, lore explanations, and theories. Channels like Markiplier, Game Theory, and thousands of others created entire ecosystems of FNAF content. An 8-year-old can spend hours per day immersed in FNAF through YouTube, absorbing every bit of lore, every theory, every detail. This represents a fundamental shift in how children consume content. Previous generations experienced media in more linear and controlled ways. You watched a movie once, played a game until you finished it. Your parents largely controlled what you had access to. Gen Z grows up in an environment of infinite on-demand content consumption. A child with a tablet can access thousands of hours of FNAF content without significant parental supervision. And much of this content is age inappropriate. Not explicitly, it's not pornographic or gratuitously violent, but thematically, FNAF deals with child murder, possession, corpse decomposition, and family trauma. The lore includes a child being bitten by an animatronic, children being lured into back rooms by a serial killer, souls of dead children trapped in robots. These are heavy and disturbing concepts. Yet 7, 8, 9-year-olds are voraciously consuming this content. They're creating fan art, writing fan fiction, developing elaborate theories about timeline and character motivation, engaging with themes of death, murder, and terror at an age where previous generations would have been largely protected from such content. What does this do to psychological development? Child psychologists are divided. Some argue that engagement with scary themes in controlled context, fiction, gaming, helps children process fears and develop resilience. Others worry that premature exposure to concepts like child murder and trauma can create anxiety or desensitization. What's indisputable is that Gen Z children are having conversations about death and violence at much younger ages than previous generations, facilitated by FNAF and similar content. A 9-year-old can articulate complex theories about William Afton's murder timeline, identify nuances in the lore about animatronic possession, and debate whether certain deaths were accidental or intentional. They're theorizing about child homicide as if it were a logical puzzle to be solved. There's something deeply uncomfortable about this when you really think about it. FNAF gamifies trauma. It transforms the worst things that can happen to children, abduction, murder, disappearance, into narrative puzzle elements. And real children are consuming this content not as horror that terrifies them, but as entertainment that fascinates them. This raises difficult ethical questions. Is it appropriate for 8-year-olds to be fluent in the lore of a fictional serial killer who lures and murders children? Even if the content is presented in game form, even if it's clearly fiction, is there an impact in normalizing these concepts? The FNAF fan community includes huge segments of pre-adolescent children creating and sharing content about the games. Much of it is creative and impressive, but some crosses into disturbing territory, graphic animations of violence, fan fiction, exploring character trauma in detail. artwork depicting death in increasingly explicit ways. And because it's all labeled fan content, it often evades the oversight that official content might receive. There's also the question of content addiction, children consuming hours of FNAF videos per day, falling into algorithmic rabbit holes of increasingly niche and intense content. YouTube's algorithm doesn't discriminate based on age appropriateness. It just pushes more of what retains attention. A child watching FNAF videos will be fed infinite FNAF videos, some age-appropriate, some less so. Parents often don't know the extent of what their children are consuming. They see colorful cartoon characters and presume innocence. They don't realize their 7-year-old is absorbing complex narratives about death, murder, and possession. When they do realize, it's often because their child is having nightmares or expressing anxiety about themes that seem too mature for their age. And yet it could be argued that FNAF is serving a function. It's giving Gen Z a framework to process their own fears about safety, trust in adults, and vulnerability. In an era of school shootings, climate change, and social instability, perhaps children need outlets to explore dark themes. Maybe FNAF is the modern version of fairy tales, inherently dark, working through primal fears through symbolic narrative. But fairy tales weren't available 24/7 through algorithms designed to maximize engagement. And fairy tales didn't create online communities where 7-year-olds interact with teenagers and adults discussing murder methods and corpse decomposition. Gen Z's relationship with FNAF is qualitatively different from millennials' relationship with their childhood horror. It's more intense, more immersive, earlier, and less mediated by adults. And the long-term consequences of this exposure remain uncertain. The industry of trauma transformed into entertainment. Five Nights at Freddy's has generated over $1 billion in revenue. There are FNAF toys, FNAF clothing, FNAF books, a FNAF movie that grossed over $280 million at the global box office. Scott Cawthon became a multimillionaire creating entertainment based on concepts of child murder, trauma, and death. This raises an uncomfortable question. Where's the line between homage and exploitation when you're profiting from trauma? FNAF isn't unique in this. The entire true crime entertainment industry profits from real tragedy. Movies about serial killers transform real victims into supporting characters. True crime podcasts dissect murders for entertainment. American Horror Story modeled entire seasons around dark historical events. We do this constantly. We take the worst things that happen to real people and transform them into commodities. FNAF operates in an interesting gray zone because it's not directly about real events. It's not the Aurora Massacre game. It's fiction inspired by reality, but the inspiration is real. The fears are real. The cultural trauma is real. And the line between being inspired by tragedy and exploiting tragedy can be painfully thin. Consider the families of real victims. The families of the 4 people murdered in Aurora, families of children who were kidnapped or injured at family entertainment establishments. How do they feel about a billion-dollar industry built around concepts that echo their worst lived nightmares? FNAF never directly references these events, so there's no legal violation. But ethically, there's something disturbing about profiting from fears that other people experienced as reality. And there's a broader question. What happens when trauma is transformed into product, when anxiety is gamified, when the worst fears of a generation are packaged and sold back to them as merchandise? One answer is that it can be cathartic. Confronting fear in controlled context helps process it. Horror games, horror movies, horror fiction all serve the psychological function of allowing us to explore our fears safely. FNAF may be helping a generation work through collective anxieties about childhood, safety, and trust. But another answer is that it desensitizes. When you consume countless hours of content about death and trauma, even in fictional form, something changes in your emotional response. The shocking becomes commonplace. The disturbing becomes entertainment. You stop genuinely processing and start just consuming. And there's profit involved. Scott Cawthon didn't create FNAF as a public service or therapeutic tool. He created it as a commercial product. Each game, each book, each piece of merchandise is designed to generate revenue. The industry around FNAF has a vested interest in keeping people engaged, consuming, spending. The deeper the lore gets, the more products can be sold. The more intense the horror, the more views videos receive. This creates a strange and potentially exploitative relationship with trauma. The anxiety that FNAF evokes isn't accidental. It's the selling point. The discomfort is the commodity. You're paying to feel a controlled version of the terror that other people experienced uncontrolled. Other examples in this category include movies based on real serial killers, where victims are reduced to supporting characters in narratives about the men who killed them, or true crime podcasts that dissect murder details while making jokes and inserting ads, or horror-themed escape rooms that recreate scenes of torture and imprisonment as entertainment. In all these cases, there's a delicate line between honoring or processing trauma versus exploiting it for profit. FNAF walks this line. It could be argued that Scott Cawthon created meaningful art that helps people confront real anxieties. It could also be argued that he built a profitable empire on a foundation of fears about harm to children. Both can be true simultaneously, and maybe that's the most disturbing part, that we can't easily separate the cathartic value from the commercial exploitation. They're intertwined. The same quality that makes FNAF psychologically resonant also makes it commercially profitable. Trauma sells. And here's the really uncomfortable part. We all participate. Every YouTube video view, every merchandise purchase, every movie ticket sold. We're complicit in the transformation of cultural trauma into consumer product. We're not passive victims being exploited. We're active consumers choosing to engage with this content. Why? Why do we choose to consume entertainment based on our worst fears? Why do we pay money to feel uncomfortable? The psychology of this is complex, but part of it comes from the fact that facing fear in a controlled environment makes us feel powerful. We survived the horror game, we process the emotion, we feel catharsis, and then we pay to do it all over again. But there's also something about modern desensitization. We live in a world of information overload, where we're exposed to constant tragedy through news and social media. Maybe we need fictionalized versions of trauma because the real ones have become too numerous to process. Maybe FNAF and similar content function as filters, giving us manageable versions of horror that would otherwise overwhelm us. Or maybe we've just become so desensitized that we need increasingly intense stimuli. Previous generations found terror in shadows and suggestion. We need explicit trauma, elaborate lore, entire universes built around disturbing concepts. And the industry is happy to provide it because trauma processed through entertainment is an infinitely renewable market. The families of real victims rarely have a voice in these conversations. There's no Aurora victims representative at the table when creative decisions are made about FNAF content. Their tragedy has become, through degrees of separation, part of the raw material of the entertainment industry. And this is perfectly legal, perfectly acceptable, perfectly normal in our culture. Maybe it should bother us more than it does. Chuck E. Cheese's still exists, but it's radically different from what it was. The company removed most of the animatronics from its locations. The elaborate shows were replaced by video screens. The focus shifted from entertainment to games. The aesthetic was modernized. The company is trying to distance itself from its own past. Why? Partially for practical reasons. Animatronics are expensive to maintain, but also because the brand recognizes that the era of performing robots has ended. The current generation of children doesn't find animatronics magical. They find them weird. They grew up with photorealistic CGI and sophisticated digital experiences. Clunky robots singing pop song covers seem antiquated at best, disturbing at worst. But here's the brutal irony. Five Nights at Freddy's may be part of the reason why Chuck E. Cheese's had to change. FNAF effectively made pizzeria animatronics synonymous with horror in the cultural consciousness. An entire generation of children now associates these robots with danger, not joy. Parents who grew up with Chuck E. Cheese's now see these establishments through the lens of FNAF and feel discomfort. Scott Cawthon, by processing his own memories and cultural anxieties, inadvertently helped kill the industry that inspired him. The real places that provided the foundation for his game are now desperately trying to escape the associations his game strengthened. And yet, FNAF keeps the era alive in another way. The new generation has no real memories of Chuck E. Cheese's in its heyday. They didn't attend birthday parties where the Rockafire explosion performed. They don't know the cultural experience that millennials and Gen X had. But they know Freddy Fazbear's. They know the concept of pizzerias with animatronics intimately through FNAF. The game has become the cultural reality for them, more real than the actual establishments that barely exist anymore. This creates a fascinating paradox. If FNAF preserves the memory of something it also corrupted, it keeps an era alive while simultaneously ensuring it can never be seen innocently again. It's cultural archaeology and cultural destruction at the same time. The few animatronic locations that remain have become pilgrimage sites for FNAF fans. People visit not out of nostalgia for the original experience, but to see the real-life inspirations for the game. They photograph worn animatronics, explore backrooms, look for similarities to Freddy Fazbear's. The real experience has become secondary to the fictional experience. Reality serves the game, not the other way around. There's also the question of literally abandoned pizzerias. When family entertainment establishments went bankrupt, many were abandoned with animatronics still inside. These places became urban legends. Urban explorers seek them out. Photographers document them. And invariably, every article or video about these abandoned locations mentions FNAF. Not, this is where children used to celebrate birthdays. It's, this is like FNAF in real life. Fiction has consumed reality. The real places now exist primarily as reference points for the game. Real history has been replaced by fan-created lore, and an entire generation knows Freddy Fazbear better than Chuck E. Cheese. This represents something fundamental about how modern culture works. We no longer experience reality directly and then create fiction about it. Now, fiction often comes first, shaping how we perceive and understand reality. FNAF didn't merely reflect fears about pizzerias. It created and intensified those fears, retroactively altering how people remember and interpret their own experiences. If you attended Chuck E. Cheese's before FNAF existed, your memories were probably positive or neutral. But if you revisit those memories now, after years of FNAF exposure, they may feel different, more sinister, more ambiguous. Fiction has contaminated memory, and you can't easily separate the two. This is FNAF's ultimate power. It didn't just create a scary game, it retrospectively rewrote the cultural memories of millions of people. It transformed nostalgia into discomfort, and it ensured that an entire era of American culture will forever be viewed through a lens of horror that it itself created. The cycle continues. FNAF generates more FNAF, more games, more books, more movies, more theories. The franchise feeds on itself, growing more elaborate, more complex, more distant from the original inspirations, yet still inexplicably tied to them. And with each new iteration, the real memories get a little more distant, a little more corrupted, until eventually, all that remains is the horror, the original joy. The real purpose of these pizzerias has been completely eclipsed by the terror that supposedly only took inspiration from them. The horror we carry. Here's the truth about Five Nights at Freddy's that nobody really wants to confront. It's not about animatronics. It never was. The robots are just symbols, visual metaphors for something much deeper and much more personal. FNAF is about places that were supposed to be safe but weren't, about trusting systems and institutions to protect children, only to discover that protection was always less guaranteed than promised. It's about the illusion of safety being shattered. It's about corrupted memories, about how we can't return to innocence once we know about the danger that was always present. Every happy birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese's now carries knowledge of Aurora. Every childhood memory of arcade games and pizza and singing animatronics now tinged with understanding that tragedy could have happened. The joy doesn't disappear completely, but it's never pure again. It's about the vulnerability of childhood, about being small in a world controlled by adults, trusting they'll keep you safe, with no power to protect yourself. FNAF captures that helplessness perfectly. You can't fight, can't run, can only wait and hope the systems hold, and sometimes they don't. It's about an entire generation that grew up under the shadow of stranger danger, panic about missing children, constant parental anxiety. Scott Cawthon created a game that gave shape to the amorphous anxieties that millennials and Gen X carried for decades. He said, "Your fears were valid, here's why," and provided narrative for feelings that had never been fully articulated. But more deeply, FNAF is about transforming trauma into entertainment as a coping mechanism. An entire generation is collectively processing the discovery that their childhood wasn't as safe as it seemed, that adults didn't always protect the way they should have, that institutions failed, that tragedy lurked beneath shiny surfaces, and they're processing it by making memes about it, playing games about it, theorizing about it, turning it into content. There's something simultaneously healthy and deeply disturbed about this. Healthy, because confronting trauma through media can be cathartic. Disturbed, because the level of consumption, commercialization, and desensitization suggests that maybe we're not really processing, just endlessly consuming without ever resolving. Why do we need to relive this horror repeatedly? Why can't we just acknowledge the trauma and move on? The answer may be that we're still stuck in it. The generation that grew up in the 80s and 90s, that experienced the stranger danger epidemic, that attended these pizzerias, that heard about Aurora and similar cases, this generation is now creating culture, and the culture it's creating reflects unresolved trauma. FNAF is a product of unprocessed cultural trauma, and its success demonstrates that millions of people share this trauma, recognize themselves in it, and are desperate for ways to explore it. The game didn't create the fears, it just made them explicit. It gave shape to shadows that were already haunting the collective consciousness. And maybe that's okay. Maybe generations always have to process their collective traumas through culture. Previous generations had their own ways of doing this. Maybe FNAF is just the modern version of dark fairy tales, cautionary myths, ghost stories told around campfires. Maybe we're always processing, always working through fears, and it never really ends. It just changes form. But there's a difference between previous generations and this one. Never before has the processing of trauma been so commercialized, so algorithmized, so consumed by such young children in such massive volumes. Never before have we had 7-year-olds theorizing about child murders as entertainment puzzles. Never before has the line between healthy catharsis and harmful desensitization been so blurred. Scott Cawthon captured something true about a generation's experience. He identified real collective fears and created a mirror for them. FNAF resonates because it touches something authentic. The horror doesn't come from random fantasy. It comes from reality reflected back to us slightly distorted. The question that remains is, what do we do with this understanding? Now that we recognize where FNAF really came from, now that we see the real events and cultural traumas behind the fiction, how do we process this? Do we continue consuming? Do we acknowledge and move on? Do we change how we think about horror entertainment? There's no easy answer, but maybe the first step is simply acknowledging the truth. When we play FNAF, when we watch videos about it, when we theorize about the lore, we're not just having fun. We're working through something real, something that happened to us collectively, something about growing up in a world that promised safety but didn't always deliver it. And maybe eventually we'll fully process it. Maybe a future generation will look at FNAF as a historical artifact, evidence of how millennials and Gen Z dealt with their particular fears. Maybe they'll have their own traumas to process, their own versions of FNAF created from their own cultural anxieties. But for now, we're stuck in the cycle, reliving the terror, consuming the horror, transforming trauma into entertainment and entertainment into trauma. And the animatronics continue to move in the shadows of our collective consciousness, permanent reminders that innocence, once lost, can never be fully recovered. The lights go out, the night begins, and you're alone with your cameras, your fears, and the knowledge that dawn is still hours away. Vlad the Impaler's journey to romantic Dracula took 500 years. The transformation of cheerful pizzerias into nightmare settings took only a few decades, and the conversion of that nightmare into a billion-dollar franchise took less than 10 years. FNAF isn't just a horror game, it's a cultural document, evidence of how we process collective trauma in the digital age, a demonstration of how real fears are transformed into entertainment, consumed, commercialized, and eventually replace the very realities that inspired them. Scott Cawthon took a real monster, not an animatronic, but the concept of violated child safety, and gave it a shape we could safely consume. Or maybe not so safely. Maybe we're all just pretending to process while really just consuming, just reliving, just sinking deeper into a cycle of trauma and entertainment that never really resolves. But here's the thing about horror. It always reveals truth. The best horror stories aren't about invented monsters. They're about real fears given form. And FNAF, at its core, is incredibly true. True about childhood vulnerability. True about familiar places hiding darkness. True about how memory and trauma intertwine. True about a generation trying to understand why their childhood always felt a little less safe than it should have. The animatronics aren't real. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza never existed, but the fears are absolutely real, and they always were. So here's something I'm curious about. Now that you know the real side of FNAF, now that you've seen the real events and cultural traumas that inspired it, does it change how you view the game? Can you still play it as pure entertainment, or does it now carry a different weight? And what does it say about us that we turn these real anxieties into one of the most successful horror franchises of all time? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how this story resonates with you.